Assalamu alaikum brothers and sisters, it's brother Ijaz Ahmed, and today I'm going to be doing a quick video response to Daniel Brubaker. Now, many of you have asked me, brother Ijaz, why haven't you done a response to Daniel before this? You haven't responded to his other videos and his book. Well, I did respond to his book along with brother Fareed and brother Mansoor, some very good brothers. The link to that document will be in the description to this video. Now, I haven't responded to his videos, generally speaking, because there has not been much substance behind them. There is actually not much to respond to, and so today I'm going to use this video as an opportunity to show you why I'm not actually interested in engaging with what he says. So in his video, in the thumbnail and both at the very start of the video, he asks a very important question. He asks, why does this correction exist in some of the early Quranic manuscripts? And I want to remind you that this claim from him is actually not a very recent one. It's actually 5 to 6 years old. It's taken from his PhD thesis, which tells you he's had about 5 years to refine the argument and to look into more manuscripts. And after 20 minutes at the very end, he says, well, I don't know why it exists, but let's first take a look and see what he says himself.
What does it mean when several of the earliest Quran manuscripts are corrected in the very same spot? So once again, we don't have anything that could account for what is happening here.
Hold on. Dan is literally saying he has no idea why he made this video in the first place. He literally starts off by asking a question after 5 years of research, and still at the end of the video he can't answer his own question. That then begs an even more important question. What then is the purpose of this video? So let's take a look now at the claim in his video. So what are we looking at on the screen right now? What you will see are 4 lines, and I've numbered them: line number 1, line number 2, line number 3, and line number 4. Each of these 4 lines represents, or 4 rows rather, represents an element or a quotation from Quran, Surah 9, verse 109, and they are from 4 different manuscripts. The first one is from BNF Arab 328, the second is from BNF Arab 330, the third is from E20, and the fourth is from a codex called Marsal 9. All you need to know is that these are 4 different manuscripts written by 4 different scribes. And so we have to account for, well, why did they make a mistake when they wrote the phrase wa ridwanan? What is the mistake that they made here? So before we get into the textual criticism of this particular ayah, I want to point out here that there are no known variations among the qira'at for this particular ayah when it comes to the phrase wa ridwanan, which then tells us that this is obviously a scribal error that the scribes have made, and that those same scribes, or rather the same authors of this particular manuscript, in each of the 4 cases that we will look at, you will see that they have corrected it themselves. So it's an error that they recognize, and it's an error that they correct. Of the 4 manuscripts, 3 make generally the same error, whereas in the 4th one, I think they just misspelled a word, or they replaced it with a phrase that they already had in their head from Quran Surah 3 Ayah 157. But when we get there, we'll come to that inshallah. I also want to point out that for this particular ayah, Surah 9 Ayah 109, that there were no known theological variants here as well. In fact, even if we were, for the sake of the argument, to omit the phrase wa ridwanan, there would not actually be any change to our beliefs. So then that would remove one of the motivations for either omitting it, this phrase, or inserting it. Otherwise, we are left with only one conclusion, and that is a scribal mistake that the scribes correct themselves. So let's take a closer look at this, inshallah. So we're looking at row number 1. In this particular manuscript, I want you to keep in mind that it's BNF Arabic 328. So what do we see in this manuscript? Typically, when Arabic is written, it's written from right to left. In English, you write from left to right. However, in Arabic and Hebrew, it is from right to left. And so what happens is the scribe has almost reached the end of the left-hand side of the page. And so they have to go from this line to a line below it, a new line. And so they're leaving the left-hand side of the page and they're going to continue writing from the right-hand side of the page on a new line. Typically, when you have to move from one line to another, a scribe tends to make a mistake here. Typically, this is known as parablepsis, or a skipping of the eye, an error caused by the eye, depending on where they were looking. And then there's another technical term you should be aware of. It's called lapsus calami, or a slip of the pen, or an error in writing. So this is a very common mistake, and it happens in any writing in almost any language. This is very typical. This is often seen as a common mistake, and so we can see that the scribe, the same scribe who is writing this particular manuscript down, he makes a mistake, or they make a mistake. They recognize their mistake while they are writing. They erase their mistake, they fix it, and then they continue. Perhaps it is the case that they made a spelling error, or they missed a particular letter in some capacity. They realized this as they were writing and corrected it immediately. And so Dan does not argue too much on this point. He acknowledges that the same scribe who wrote the manuscript is the same scribe that made the correction, and the way that the correction is made, it does not seem to be in post-production, but rather while the scribe was still completing the manuscript. So we have no issue here. Let's move on to our second example in row number 2. So in row number 2, we have BNF Arabic 330. And again, we find a very similar circumstance. The scribe has reached the end of the left-hand side of the page and has to continue writing in a new line below it to the starting at the right-hand side of the page. And you can see that they perhaps omitted the word Redwanin. And so this is again a common error in textual criticism. We know this as again parablepsis. So they've made a skipping of the eye. They could have believed that they already wrote the word, and as they looked at whatever manuscript they were copying from, when they started a new line, they accidentally omitted it. And so again, this is not something nefarious or conspiratorial. This is something which happens in almost all manuscripts of all languages, of all literary works. There is nothing to debate here as well. However, I want to point out that the same scribe, as you know, as pointed out in our previous example from row number 1, we find a similar circumstance in row number 2. In this particular manuscript, the scribe who is writing the entire codex, or the entire manuscript, recognizes their own error and they themselves correct it. Perhaps it is while they were finishing and double checking. This is something that is typically done. You have someone else overlook and see if you've made any mistakes, or you yourself, before you give the copy to a customer, you will review it for any mistakes made. And so as you can see in row number 2, they erased whatever mistake that they made, likely here an omission, what we would call haplography. And so an omission basically is what has happened here. The scribe has recognized it themselves and they have corrected it and they have continued writing. Now, here is the problem with Dan's claim. He actually makes two different claims about the scribe which wrote this particular manuscript, claims which are contradictory. I think the reason he comes up with this contradiction is because he himself either made a mistake in thinking through what he is seeing before him, or I think it is perhaps that he himself was uncertain about the circumstance, did not look into it properly, and in the process of recording his own video, he accidentally contradicts himself. So let's take a quick look at that while we can.
And as you can see in this manuscript, although you can tell it's a different scribe, it's clearly a different handwriting style. And this is one of the interesting things about the Hijazi scripts. And at some point, I will do a video on the different script styles to give you an introduction to. I should do that soon. Okay, so this has been written over an erasure. It does look like the work of the original scribe to me. The writing style is similar. Maybe it's not quite as confident, but I'm not willing to say that it was not the original scribe. I think this does look like it is the work of the original scribe. and probably near the time of first production of this manuscript, although we can't be for sure on that.
So, in other words, he actually contradicts himself and he does not know what he's saying. I'm surprised at this because he's meant to be, or at least he tries to give the impression in the community that he is a competent scholar, but in the space of about 2 minutes, he both makes an argument and refutes his own argument. So it's a little bit embarrassing having to do this video on his behalf to point out, like, listen, Dan, you gotta get it together and actually make reasonable claims where you don't, and this is important now, where you don't refute yourself. Now we come to row number 3, and this is manuscript E20. And so what he basically says is in row number 3, a later scribe, a different scribe, realizes that there is a mistake here of some sort, and a different scribe at some later point in time tries to make the correction, and he bases his arguments on the writing style and on the thickness of the stroke of the pen. Now, technically, this is what we normally do. This is what we look for to decipher whether or not the same scribe has made a self-correction, or if a second hand, or if a second scribe made the correction for them, and we try to see, did this correction happen in the same time frame, close in proximity to each other, or is it something which happens at a much later point in time? Now, Dan in his video, without presenting the evidence, just looks at it, at a very surface level, and he says, this looks like 2 different scribes, clearly a later scribe. However, while reviewing scans of this particular manuscript, I have found examples where the same scribe has written with the same angle and sometimes with the same thickness of the pen. So it just seems to be the case that the same scribe has a variable writing style. How do we know it's the same scribe? Well, because in the places where they write in this slanted fashion, which is similar to the words Waridwan in Surah 9, Ayah 109, we don't find erasures in those places, which means that where the scribe writes in this slanted fashion in a different way, he tends not to erase every time he writes in a slanted way. And so what I think has happened is Dan found this verse, looked just at this particular area, realized that the writing style was slightly different, and then made a conclusion without looking throughout the rest of the manuscript to see whether or not you can find out if the scribe has written in this slanted fashion previously. And so I'm just going to look at what we call the first folio, or the first page. It's folio 1R, and we're going to look at a few lines here. You will see, as I point them out on the screen in red rectangles, where the scribe writes in a very similar fashion. So what we have on the screen right now, in the background with the red squares, we have folio 1 recto from the Codex E20. Now, what you will notice here is that in the red, I've highlighted, this is from Surah Al-Baqarah, verses 17 to 29. You can tell that the scribe, by looking at the red squares, he tends to write at a slant, whereas the words within the yellow box is from page or folio 22V, and this is what contains Quran Surah 9 verse 109, which is what Dan highlights in his video. So as you can see, the scribe does write with a right-angled stroke at some places. In fact, this is not the only place where he does so. Let's take a look at another example. So on the screen right now, what you should be seeing is folio 5B, and this, I believe that this contains Surah 5 verse 4 to Surah 5 verse 9. You will notice again in the red box I've highlighted, or I've put for you, where the scribe writes with a right-angled stroke compared to the yellow box which has the word Allah from Surah 9 verse 109 from the same manuscript, which is Codex E20. So here again we can see that the scribe, the same scribe, has a varied writing style. Now this is not unusual. Typically it may happen with a unskilled scribe, or a person who generally has less experience overall, but the case has been set that just because they've written with a more of a right-angled stroke, this does not mean that they're two different scribes. I also want to point out that in both examples, Dan did claim for this example number 3, specifically that the ink color was different. It was blacker to him. Now, when I double checked, it seems to be the case that throughout this manuscript, there are cases where the same black writing can generally be found in unedited places. So typically what we can see here is that the manuscript has been damaged, usually through wear and tear. There seems to be some liquid damage in some different places. This may very well explain the patches of black and the patches of brown. So this does not indicate by any meaningful way or any meaningful criteria that these are two different scribes. Generally here, we can fully and completely understand that the same scribe made the same correction. I want to point out again as well that just as in case number 1 and case number 2, in this case as well, the scribe is going from the end of one line and they're starting a new line. So they've left from the left-hand side of the page, they've gone one line below, and now they continue writing from the right-hand side of the page. And again, this is where we would expect to find this error. And so that this happens time and again, at least only in these 3 particular manuscripts, it tells us that of course there is a common issue here, and the common issue here is the skipping of the I moving from one line to the other, and thus it causes a particular error in this place. I want to note as well that we can't seem to replicate this this error in almost any other manuscript I've looked at, and we will look at further example ourselves as well. The point, however, stands that unlike what Dan says, we can actually find a very easy, reasonable explanation for these circumstances. Basically, what Dan says is, when he tries to find the category of the error here, he says he was unable to categorize it as either dictography or haplography. I'll explain those two terms right now. They're slightly technical terms, but work with me. Dictography would mean where you have a repetition of a particular letter, word, or phrase by the scribe. So they unintentionally repeat something. Whereas haplography is where they unintentionally omit something. So they omit a letter, they omit a word, or they omit a phrase, causing them to have a mistake in the text. Now, this is very common knowledge. So when Dan says he considered dictography, it slightly confuses me because, at least in this case, there is no repetition of any particular letter, word, or phrase. Rather, what we find is an omission where the scribe then corrects the word that they omitted, the phrase that they omitted, and they insert what they forgot. So this would actually fall into the category of haplography, where something is omitted and the scribe then corrects the omission by placing the word or the phrase or the letter that was meant to be there. So in this case, do we actually have a reason to say that there was a formula in the scribe's mind when they were writing Surah 9, Ayah 109, causing them to omit the phrase waridwanin between the words Allah and khair? Well, actually, yes, there is. So within the Quran itself, the phrase Allahu khair, right? These two words, Allah and khair, occur 15 times in the Quran. I'm going to recount them for you fairly quickly. It's in Surah 2, Ayah 103, Surah 3, Ayah 54, Surah 3, Ayah 198, Surah 8, verse 30, Surah 62, verse 11, twice, Surah 11, verse 31, Surah 11, verse 86, Surah 12, verse 64, Surah 20, verse 73, Surah 27, verse 36, Surah 27, verse 59, Surah 28, verse 60, Surah 28, verse 80, Surah 42, verse 36. So 15 times, which means that the scribe likely had this phrase in mind, and so when they were writing Surah 9, Ayah 109, they would not have had the less frequently used phrase in mind. So in this case, the phrase phrase waridwanin, this is something between, again, remember here, between the words Allah and khair. And so we expect them to omit this phrase because it's only used 4 times in the Quran. And so they would omit it out of habit. This is not what they would normally write, and so this is, again, as I mentioned, a very common error, and this is what we would consider haplography. So not only is it easily explainable, I think anyone, even a beginner, when they look at these examples, they will almost immediately see what the issue was. So there was nothing nefarious here about the omission and then the self-correction. All this correction means is that the scribe, while writing, noticed that they omitted something and then they corrected their own mistake. In this case, an omission because of 2 particular reasons. One, they had to move from the end of one line and start a second new line, and when this change or transition is done, a scribe is more likely to commit an error of the eye, parablapsis, and they make a written error, a lapsus calami. So this is simple, straightforward information. So what then about the last example, row number 4? Well, this is from Marcel 9, and it's a pretty good example. I'll tell you why. What Dan basically says is between the 2 yellow boxes, in the first yellow box you have the word Allah, and in the second yellow box on the left you have the words khairun am. And so in this case he says, the scribe between these 2 yellow boxes made a mistake with the phrase waridwanin. And so in this case, it is likely that they made a spelling error, or they had in mind a similar phrase from Quran Surah 3 Ayah 157, where I think the word rahmah is actually used here. So in this case, it's easily explainable, easily understood. It's not at the start of a line or at the end of a line, it's in the middle of a page. And in this case, it seems plainly obvious that the same scribe made an error, noticed it, and before they continued, they corrected it and sorted it out directly. Likely, like I said, I think that they at least had the words from Surah 3 Ayah 157 in mind. And this generally wraps up the 4 claims that he has made about these 4 manuscripts. At the end of the day, he has not demonstrated or qualified his claims, and after 5 years of research, he is still reaching or grasping at straws. This is something which is, I would have to say, highly unusual, and I would also say playing into the hands of those who are anti-Islamic polemicists. We actually, when we have to do manuscript studies, we must hold ourselves to a higher, more reasonable standard, and we must let the evidence speak for itself. We should not make claims, hype up certain statements, and then fail to deliver 5 years down the road. Lastly, we're going to look at a manuscript, Top Copy Sarai Medina 1A. This is roughly contemporaneous to the other manuscripts that he has highlighted. Specifically, we're looking at folio 38, recto, line 19, and we will see the words waridwanin there in the red rectangle. I'll zoom in so you can see it more clearly, so you can see that this was not a later insertion by anyone. It is present at the exact same time as the other manuscripts highlighted in this video today and in Dan's video. I also want to point out that there is another manuscript, Qaf 47 on the screen, and you will see it has the exact same words in the exact same order without any editing, and it is potentially at least one of the earliest manuscripts of the Quran within the 7th century CE. And so this is instrumental in demonstrating that, guess what, we have contemporaneous manuscripts to the ones he has shown, and we have even earlier ones without any change to the text. So we need to keep in mind Dan's prevailing theory that the Quran has some kind of degree of textual fluidity to it, and that scribes can add and change at whim. However, as we've just seen, the evidence does not seem to indicate this, and as he himself says in his video, many people have been waiting a long time for one of the examples that he would be showing in that very video, the one I'm responding to. But in the video I have responded to, as you can clearly see, not only is the text remarkably stable, we find the scribes to be very consistent where they make the same mistake and then correct it themselves. In fact, what we should find, if Dan's theory is true for these particular passages, that the same scribes that made the mistake, they should not have corrected it themselves. They should have waited centuries, 100 years later perhaps, and then someone else should find it and correct it if there was this degree of flexibility. Therefore, via proof by contradiction, we have demonstrated his claim to not just be false, but also academically absurd. Now, I want to point out as well, in terms of statistics, what he has demonstrated here is actually contradictory to the point he was trying to prove. What he has shown here is that scribes made a self-correction. What he has not shown is that a scribe created a new reading and then this reading popularly spread, and then other scribes changed their own manuscripts to reflect this new reading. We don't seem to see this. We don't see this in any capacity, and therefore what he has demonstrated is statistically, if I'm being honest here, useless. Rather, on the other hand, what we do not seem to see, and let me make this clear here, if Dan did have a case, then after 5 or 6 years of constant in-depth research, he should find, at least he should be able to find one such example. And as you will notice, he did not make that claim in his video that these 4 examples are demonstrative of his main claim, the flexibility of the Quranic text. What it actually seems to be is that he's left it an open-ended question. He still seems to be searching for something to prove his case, and this clearly, if I'm being honest, is not it. Dan, if you're watching this video, you can do a better job, but let me give you the heads up right now, you're not going to find such an example. Otherwise, this is it for me, brothers and sisters. Thank you for your attention and time. Assalamu alaikum.